If Hale had stayed a normal woman, maybe she'd be worth celebrating tonight. That was the first sentence I heard as I stepped into the Cedar Falls Country Club ballroom, still holding my breath from the cold Iowa wind outside. My mother said it with a soft laugh, the kind she used on church friends, the kind she saved for moments when she wanted to sound humble while sliding a knife between my ribs. She flies around pretending to be a hero. Brandon closes million-dollar deals. That's real work. The women around her chuckled, clutching their wine glasses, pearls shaking gently on their collars, as if they agreed with every word. I stayed frozen at the doorway, my hand tightening around the strap of my small purse, the one thing I brought instead of my uniform. My heartbeat kicked into my throat. 8 hours on the road from Kansas to Iowa, and this was the welcome I got. I stood there long enough for the laughter to fade before I stepped inside. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to steady. I told myself that surviving worse things did not magically make family easier. My name is Hale Avery Vaughn. I am 30 years old. My hair was tied back in the same low knot I wear under my flight helmet. My shirt was plain. My boots were dusty from rest stops along the way. Just last week, a general pinned a bronze star to my chest while my team clapped and my crew chief squeezed my shoulder in that quiet way soldiers do when emotions are not supposed to be spoken out loud. The men I pulled off the battlefield hugged me with tears on their faces. But here in my hometown, I was still the kid who never grew up, the one who embarrassed the family. In Fort Riley, they call me Ghost Angel. In Cedar Falls, I am the daughter no one mentions unless it is to apologize for. As I moved closer, my mother finally noticed me. The bright social smile she wore for her guests slipped away like it had never been real in the first place. "Oh, you made it," she said, as if I had ruined her timing. "Try not to scare the guests with your war stories." Before I could answer, Brandon swooped in with a half hug that felt like a handshake with a stranger. He turned to the table behind him and joked loudly, "Careful, everyone. She thinks flying a government helicopter makes her important." Someone laughed. A few did not know if they should. Above him hung a giant printed banner that read, "Celebrating 70 years of Carol and Brandon's outstanding year." There was no mention of me, no photo, not even a corner. The staff handed out table assignments. Brandon and his wife sat at the head table next to my mother. The circle of what she called her accomplished guests filled the tables nearest them. My card pointed me toward a round table tucked near the hallway to the restrooms, where the scent of disinfectant wafted every time the door opened. My seatmates were 2 children playing with crayons and a distant cousin who barely remembered my name. Dee Maline walked by and tapped the back of my chair. "Sit there, Hale. You like being stationed near exits anyway, don't you?" It landed harder than she understood. Not because I cared about seating, but because the people in this room would never know how close I had come to exits that meant life or death. A woman I vaguely recognized from high school leaned toward me. "So you're just flying supply runs these days?" she asked, her voice full of harmless curiosity that cut deeper than shouting would have. I almost told her the truth that supply runs were only one small piece of what my crew and I did, that the night the mountain ridge lit up with enemy fire, I had flown lower than doctrine allowed, that I had taken us through a narrow pass to reach 4 soldiers bleeding into the dust. Instead, I smiled and said, "Something like that." I told myself they would not understand. I told myself they did not deserve to know. The pastor who acted as tonight's MC tapped the microphone and invited my mother to speak. She stood at the front of the room glowing under the chandeliers. "I always dreamed my daughter would marry, have kids, and settle down here," she said. "Instead, she runs around in combat boots. But at least Brandon gave us something to be proud of." The laughter that followed was soft but sharp as glass. My hand shook when I lifted my water glass, but I kept my face still. Pain was familiar. Silence was familiar. But something inside me shifted when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced down, expecting a routine notification. Instead, a secured message glowed on the screen. "Classified Ghost Angel, stand by for tomorrow's ceremony confirmation. 0900 Fort Riley HQ. General Martin presiding. My breath stilled. Tomorrow, an entire room of senior officers would stand for me. Tomorrow, my name would echo through a hall filled with uniforms and medals and respect. Tonight, I sat next to the restroom. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and straightened in my chair. The hurt was still there, but underneath it, something calmer, colder, more dangerous settled into place. I lifted my eyes toward the front of the room and let a small smile curve at the corner of my mouth. They had no idea who I was. They had no idea what was coming. I grew up in a house where image mattered more than truth, and appearances mattered more than the people living inside those walls. A house where my mother Carol floated through every room with the precision of someone always performing for an invisible audience, and where my brother Brandon, 2 years older and infinitely more adored, was lifted onto every pedestal available, while I stood at the base, looking up, learning early that the spotlight in Cedar Falls never had room for me. My earliest memory of that imbalance comes from being 6 years old, watching Mom smooth Brandon's collar before a church brunch, while telling him proudly that everyone would want to hear about his spelling bee win. And when I tugged her sleeve to show her I had drawn a picture of the church building, she said gently to him, rather than to me, "That is my boy. He always makes us look good." The sentence settled into my bones long before I understood how deep its shadow would stretch. As I got older, the message sharpened into something that stung rather than confused, like the day I was 10 and ran through the yard in a pair of worn shorts playing soccer alone, because no one wanted scuffed grass before company arrived. And when a ball bounced against the patio, my mother stepped outside with a frozen smile that faltered when she saw me. She marched over, grabbed my arm, and hissed that I looked like a boy and was humiliating her, then slapped me before smoothing her blouse and returning inside as if nothing had happened, leaving me holding my cheek with the knowledge that a daughter who did not fit her vision was a problem to be corrected rather than a child to be loved. Brandon grew into his role as the golden son effortlessly, a natural performer who thrived on praise, and Mom fed it to him, constantly announcing his grades, his awards, his teams, his newest achievements to anyone standing still, long enough to listen, while my own report cards, which never dipped below A-, were tucked into a drawer with the explanation that girls should not show off. Every dinner with extended family became a stage for him. Every Christmas card featured his highlights, and every time he breezed through a room, Mom's face brightened in a way I never saw directed toward me. And I learned to observe, instead of compete, to shrink instead of shine, telling myself that maybe silence was safer than trying. By the time I was 14, the shape of my life felt set. Yet a small part of me kept reaching for something outside that house. Which is why when a JROTC recruiter visited our school and showed us videos of cadets learning leadership and strength and discipline, something in my chest clicked, as if I had found a compass pointing toward a possible self. I carried the application home carefully, imagining how surprising and maybe even impressive it would be if I joined. But when my mother saw the form on the kitchen counter, she didn't question or discuss. She simply picked it up, tore it into strips with calm precision, and told me that no daughter of hers would parade around in boots and embarrass the family even more. I stood there watching paper pieces flutter into the trash, realizing she had not even read my name on the form before discarding it, feeling the small flame in my chest flicker but not die. That was the beginning of my private rebellion, not loud or visible, but steady, an inner vow to collect every slight, to remember every moment I was told to disappear, and to hold on to them like guideposts marking a road out. I learned how to survive in that house by listening more than speaking, and by storing every insult as proof that the world had to be bigger than Cedar Falls, and I practiced resilience in quiet ways, running early in the mornings, reading about pilots and rescue missions while hiding the book jackets, and imagining a version of myself that did not need permission to exist. My mother, meanwhile, tightened her grip in ways that looked gentle to outsiders but felt suffocating at home. Picking my clothes, steering my friends, commenting on my posture, My hair, my weight, always framing her criticism as concern, always comparing me to Brandon, whose life unfolded exactly the way she wanted. And yet, even then, I sensed a future pulling me toward it, something sharp and real just outside my grasp. The final blow came when I was 17, a week after I secretly submitted my preliminary applications for service academies, including West Point, a dream I never dared say out loud. And I remember tiptoeing home after school, imagining the letter arriving, imagining the possibility that someone somewhere saw potential in me beyond being the second child. But one afternoon, I opened our shared family email on the home computer, and I saw the automated message thanking me for withdrawing my interest, a message I had never sent, and next to it in the trash folder was the interview invitation from West Point, scheduled for the following month. When I confronted my mother, she didn't bother pretending confusion. She simply said it was for my own good, that she could not let me ruin my life in a uniform that she knew better what my future should look like. And besides, Brandon had just been accepted into a business leadership program, and the family needed to focus on him during this busy year. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on the floor with the realization that the path I wanted would never be allowed as long as I lived under her roof. That night, I made my first real independent decision. I searched for ROTC scholarships and enlisted pathway options routes that did not require parental approval. And for the first time in my life, the unfairness did not crush me. It clarified me. It pushed me toward a future that would no longer be dictated by the woman downstairs rehearsing a speech about her perfect son. I understood then that I would choose the long road, the harder road, the road that led away from everything familiar, because staying would mean accepting that I was the failure they said I was, and leaving meant proving to myself that their version of me was not the truth. I chose to leave. Leaving Cedar Falls at 18 felt like slipping out of a cage that had been disguised as a home, and once I crossed the state line toward Kansas, I promised myself I would not look back until I had become someone my mother could no longer shrink, someone whose worth could not be erased with a look or a sentence. So I went straight into an ROTC program, where nobody cared about family reputations or who shined at church brunches. They only cared about discipline, effort, and the weight you could carry without breaking. And for the first time in my life, I felt the strange relief of being evaluated on what I did rather than who I was supposed to be. Training was harsher than anything I had imagined, long pre-dawn runs that left my lungs burning, leadership drills, where hesitation meant failure, navigation exercises that forced me to trust instincts I had never been allowed to develop in my own home. Yet every time my legs shook or my voice wavered, I remembered the email that had been deleted behind my back and the interview I never got to attend, and something hardened inside me, a quiet determination that felt heavier and stronger than anger. By the time I commissioned into the Army and earned a spot in aviation training, I had become a version of myself my family would not recognize, someone who moved with purpose, who did not need validation from the people who had always withheld it. And when I first climbed into a cockpit and felt the thrum of the engine through my body, I knew without doubt that I had found the life that had been meant for me all along. Flight school at Fort Rucker demanded everything. The hours were brutal, and the instructors unrelenting, each mistake amplified until it felt like a spotlight burning my skin. But I learned quickly, not because I was naturally gifted, but because failure was no longer an option. I refused to let the years of being dismissed define the rest of my life. And every time I successfully executed a maneuver or landed cleanly on a narrow pad, my confidence grew in slow, steady layers. When I finally earned my place flying Blackhawks, the responsibility settled into me like a second spine, and I carried that responsibility with me in the year 2017 when I deployed to Afghanistan, stepping into a heat that felt heavy enough to crush the unready. But I was not unready, and the mission tempo left little room for hesitation. My first months were filled with transport flights, resupply missions, and the occasional medevac that tested my ability to stay calm while chaos pressed into the windows. Yet none of those moments prepared me for the rescue that would change everything, the night that would carve my name into the memories of people who had never met me, yet owed me their lives. It happened on a moonless night when the sky melted into the mountains. A call came in about a convoy hit by an ambush, several soldiers wounded, and pinned one helicopter already down with mechanical failure. The landing zone described as hostile and compromised, and I knew before lifting off that the risk was higher than anything I had flown into before, but refusing was not in my vocabulary, not after all the doors that had been slammed in my face by people who should have opened them. As we approached the coordinates, the radio crackled with warnings, heavy fire from the West Ridge, potential targeting, from below tracers stitching the darkness in thin red lines, and my crew chief shouted that we were being locked by someone with more determination than accuracy. Yet I pushed forward, scanning the uneven terrain, until the outlines of wounded soldiers came into view, their chem lights glowing faintly like the last breaths of a dying fire. The ground fire intensified, and my co-pilot yelled that we should pull back, but something in me refused a surge of certainty, anchoring my hands as I guided the Black Hawk into a narrow gap between two rocky outcrops, touching down on unstable soil, while dust and debris whipped around us. And the second the wheels kissed the earth, the medics leapt out, pulling injured bodies aboard, counting 4 casualties with varying levels of trauma. One young soldier, barely 20, stared at me through blood smeared over his temple and whispered that we were not real, that we looked like angels coming out of the dark, and his voice cracked with a mix of awe and desperation, a sentence so raw it wrapped itself around me tighter than any praise I had received in my entire childhood. When we lifted off again, the radio reports followed us like shadows, teams calling us insane, brave, reckless, heroic. And when we finally touched down at the field hospital, the flight surgeons pulled the men out, and one of them grabbed my arm, saying he had never seen a pilot hold a bird steady under that much fire. And the name Angel must have traveled faster than I realized, because within 24 hours, people were calling me Ghost Angel, not loudly, but quietly, respectfully, the way soldiers name something that has saved them. In the following weeks, a helmet cam video circulated internally, showing the wounded soldier whispering that line again. You were like an angel out of the dark, and though it was never released publicly, it spread far enough that commanders and generals nodded at me with an extra weight in their gaze, offering challenge coins and handshakes that meant more than any photo slideshow back home ever could. My reputation grew in places my family would never think to look, whispered among crews, mentioned in briefings tucked into the stories, told by those who had been pulled from danger, and I carried that recognition with a humility born from years of being overlooked. The twist came near the end of that deployment, when I was called into an office without being told why, and a senior officer asked if I would be willing to support a JSOC-affiliated unit for certain operations requiring precise night extractions. He mentioned that my ability to stay steady under fire had caught attention far above my brigade, and though the details were limited, I understood the magnitude instantly. This was not an offer given lightly, and it was not given often. I agreed without hesitation, aware that the path I was stepping onto would never be visible to the people who spent years belittling me. And as I walked out of that office, I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that while my family still saw me as the disappointment, the rest of the Army saw me as something close to a legend, a ghost angel moving through the dark, leaving no trace except the lives brought home. Returning from deployment had always felt like stepping from one universe into another, yet nothing disoriented me, quite like the message that appeared in my inbox a few weeks after my last rotation, a family group email I had not seen traffic in for months, suddenly lighting up with the subject line, Mother's 70th Big Celebration Attendance Expected, and the body of the email written in my mother's clipped formal tone, saying, "We are throwing a big 70th for Mom. You should finally show up for family Hale," the phrasing so casual and accusatory that I read it twice. seeing the implication behind every word, as if my years away saving soldiers meant I had abandoned them, as if sacrifice abroad translated into selfishness at home. A few minutes later, another notification popped up this time, a private text from Brandon, his message short enough to feel like a command rather than a suggestion. "Do not wear your uniform, this is not about you," and the dismissiveness hit me harder than it should have, stirring that familiar old ache that seemed to wake any time my family reached into my life. I stared at the phone, feeling the distance between who they thought I was and who I had become stretch wider than the miles between Kansas and Iowa, and for a moment I considered ignoring the entire thing. But something inside me, maybe a stubborn part of myself that refused to let them pretend my absence was a choice, rooted in apathy, rather than survival, pushed me to respond with a simple "fine, I will be there." The morning I packed for the 8-hour drive towards Cedar Falls, the Kansas sky was pale and cool, and I moved around my apartment in a haze that made me feel younger than I was, as if every step into that old world turned me back into the version of myself they had shaped. But when I placed my keys on the counter, my phone buzzed again this time with a call from my executive officer at Fort Riley, who told me without any buildup that there was a strong possibility I would be formally recognized in a ceremony the day after tomorrow, that General Martin himself might preside if the paperwork cleared, and that I should remain flexible and available. His tone carried weight, the kind that told me this was not a routine recognition, but something bigger, something that might shift the next phase of my career. And as I thanked him, a strange warmth spread through me, the kind that comes when the world finally begins to acknowledge the effort you poured into it. I hung up, sat down on the edge of my bed, and made the decision instantly I would tell no one in my family about it. Not now, not until they heard it from somewhere that did not require me to justify it, because I knew exactly what would happen if I shared it prematurely. My mother would tell me not to brag, Brandon would downplay it or twist it into a joke, and my father would pretend my achievements were interesting but not relevant to anything that mattered. The decision to keep it quiet felt like laying the first brick in a wall I had been building for years, a boundary that said some things belonged to me alone, especially the things they could not twist into something smaller. As I drove north, the landscape shifted slowly, Kansas fields stretching into the soft hills of Missouri, and then the flatter farmland of Iowa, and with every hour my thoughts drifted back to the last time I set foot in my childhood home, more than a year earlier. A moment that had begun with cautious hope and ended in the same familiar disappointment. I remembered walking through the front door still smelling faintly of jet fuel and desert air after a redeployment, feeling bone-tired but proud of the work I had done. And before I even finished saying hello, my mother had ushered me toward the living room where relatives and neighbors were gathered not to welcome me home, but to celebrate Brandon, closing some real estate deal that everyone acted like a national achievement. People cheered, raised glasses, asked him questions for nearly an hour, and when someone finally turned to me and said, "You were overseas, right?" What was that? Like the moment lasted 3 seconds before another person cut in to ask Brandon if he planned to expand his business into the next county. That night, I had gone to bed in my old room with its faded curtains and dusty trophies from a childhood no one remembered, lying awake with the same suffocating sense of invisibility that had followed me through adolescence until I left for the army and never looked back. So now, as the miles passed beneath my tires, I braced myself for more of the same feeling, that old heaviness settle in my chest, the one I used to mistake for guilt, but now recognized as grief, for the family I wished I had rather than the one I did. When I crossed the Cedar Falls city limits sign, I felt a ripple of nerves I tried to swallow down, and as I drove through familiar streets lined with the same brick buildings and trimmed lawns, the memories pressed in from every direction, some sharp, some dull, all carrying traces of the girl I used to be. I parked outside the country club where the celebration would be held, the lot half full already. Even though I was early, and before stepping out of the car, I sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel, breathing in and out until I felt steady. I reminded myself of the call from my executive officer of the ceremony that could alter the course of my career, of the fact that somewhere in the next 48 hours, a room full of military leaders might stand to honor me, and letting that truth settle in my bones allowed me to rise a little taller as I stepped out into the crisp Iowa air. I was walking into a place where they still saw me as the forgotten daughter, but I carried with me the truth of the woman I had become, and the contrast between those two identities felt like a fuse waiting to be lit. I locked the car, straightened my shirt, and whispered inwardly that no matter what happened inside those walls, tonight, tomorrow held something they could never dim. Not with their words, not with their disregard, and as I started toward the entrance, I felt the first hint that a storm was gathering, not around me, but within me. Quiet and deliberate, a storm they had created long ago, without realizing one day the wind would shift in my direction. I arrived at the Cedar Falls Country Club earlier than anyone expected, partly because the long drive had kept me too wired to rest, and partly because I wanted a moment to breathe before stepping into the familiar performance my family turned every gathering into. Yet the moment I pushed open the polished doors and walked into the reception hall, I realized those hopes were useless because my mother was already surrounded by guests, her laugh bright and performative, her hands gesturing elegantly as she praised Brandon for his new house, his latest contract, and a glossy magazine spread that featured him posing beside a development site, and she never once glanced toward the entrance where I stood watching, waiting forgotten. I approached slowly, feeling the hum of conversation and the clink of glasses, and when she finally noticed me, it was only because a woman beside her whispered something while looking in my direction, prompting my mother to offer a startled, "Oh, Hale, you made it," and then turn right back to her circle without introducing me, as if acknowledging me too fully might dim the glow she worked so hard to cast around Brandon. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before drifting toward a quieter corner, but even then, people seemed to notice me, only long enough to ask dismissive questions, like the man from church who smiled politely and said, "So do you just fly generals around or what?" His tone light and amused, as if flying a multi-million-dollar aircraft in a war zone were a novelty or a party trick, rather than a skill refined by years of training and responsibility. And I forced a small smile, responding with something vague, while swallowing the familiar sting that came whenever someone reduced my work to a caricature. The room filled rapidly more relatives I barely recognized, and more acquaintances who all seemed to orbit Brandon, congratulating him, asking for updates, praising his ambition, while I remained on the edge of every conversation, like an uninvited guest at my own mother's event, and I reminded myself again and again that tomorrow's ceremony was real, that the silence around me tonight could not erase the truth of who I was outside these walls. As I walked deeper into the hall, I noticed the large projector screen being set up near the stage, a detail that had not been mentioned in the invitation, and curiosity tugged at me even before the lights dimmed and the MC tapped the microphone to gather attention, announcing a special slideshow to celebrate Carol's 70 years of life and the people who made her proud. I felt my stomach tighten, even before the first images appeared, a sequence of smiling pictures of my mother cradling Brandon as a baby. Brandon on his first day of school. Brandon in his prom tux. Brandon at college graduation, and then my parents posed beside him at his engagement party, his first real estate closing, his groundbreaking ceremony, his new home. And with each photo, the audience murmured with admiration, while my eyes scanned every frame, searching for even the smallest trace of myself, a stray arm, a blurred corner, anything that might confirm I had existed in the family history being projected in front of this room, but there was nothing. Not a single picture of me from childhood, adolescence, or adulthood. No mention of my achievements, no acknowledgement of my presence in this family, despite the years I had spent trying to earn even a fraction of recognition. When the slideshow reached its end, the silence inside me was sharp enough to hurt, and I forced myself to look away from the screen, just as Brandon stepped beside me with a grin nudging my arm as he whispered, "We did not have any nice pictures of you. You are always in camo." His voice laced with amusement rather than malice, as if erasing me from the narrative of our family history were a harmless oversight rather than a deliberate wound. Something inside me fractured in a quiet, irreversible way, not loudly, not with anger, but with a clarity so crisp it felt like stepping into cold air after being underwater too long. And for a moment, I wondered if he or anyone else in that room would ever understand the depth of what it meant to be excluded from your own life story. I excused myself pretending I needed water, though what I really needed was to gather my breath before the weight of humiliation crushed me completely. And as I stood alone near the refreshments table, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a small vibration that offered a brief anchor in a sea of disorientation. I pulled it out expecting a routine message, but when I saw the sender, my heart jolted. It was one of my closest crew members from Fort Riley, someone who rarely texted during off hours unless it mattered, and the message was short, but powerful people here are talking. They say Ghost Angel might get the Distinguished Flying Cross. The words blurred for a moment as my chest tightened, not with disbelief, but with the overwhelming contrast between the two worlds I lived in, because here, in this crowded hall filled with relatives who could not even put one picture of me on a slideshow, I was invisible, a footnote, an afterthought, and yet hundreds of miles away in the Army community that had shaped me. I was being spoken of with reverence, considered for one of the highest honors a pilot could receive my name, whispered with respect by people who understood the cost of the missions I flew. I read the message again and again, letting its truth settle into the cracks of the wound inflicted moments earlier, and a strange sense of alignment washed over me. Not happiness, but a quiet, anchored certainty that the people in this room did not define me, that they never had, and that no amount of dismissal from them could erase the way the world outside these walls had come to see me. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and straightened my shoulders, aware that the humiliation of the slideshow had cut deep, but also aware that the honor mentioned in the message meant something far greater than their approval ever could. And as the lights brightened again and laughter filled the room, I walked back into the crowd with a steadiness that surprised even me, knowing now with absolute clarity that the narrative they crafted about my worth was not only incomplete, but entirely false. The moment the lights dimmed again and the MC stepped back onto the small stage, positioned beneath crystal chandeliers, I felt the atmosphere inside the hall shift, subtly tightening in that familiar way that always preceded one of my mother's carefully curated speeches, and when he announced that Carol Vaughn would now share a few words in honor of her 70th year, the room responded with polite applause as she moved forward with the poised grace she had perfected over decades of hosting church luncheons and charity dinners. I watched her adjust the microphone, smoothing the front of her sequined dress, as though preparing the audience for a performance rather than a heartfelt moment. And when she smiled, her smile was wide and confident, the kind of smile that promised everyone they were about to hear something flattering. Yet even before she opened her mouth, I knew that whatever came next would carve another wound into me. She began by thanking everyone for coming, listing names of family, friends, and church elders who had supported her. Then she shifted into praising Brandon's accomplishments, describing him as the pillar of pride in her life, the child who had given her grandbabies and a good name in this town, and then with a small, disdainful laugh, she added the line that made my breath stop in my chest. One child gave me grandbabies and a good name in this town. The other, well, we all have disappointments, do we not? And her voice was so light and casual that it sounded like a joke, even though she meant it entirely. While the room reacted with an uncomfortable ripple of laughter, people glancing around nervously but no one speaking up. I stood at my table, feeling the words press against me like a weight I had carried for so long. It no longer knocked me down, but I could feel a deep burn spreading through my chest, the kind that comes not from shock, but from familiarity, from hearing a wound reopen in the same place it had been cut many times before. When she finished her speech, the MC invited Brandon to take the microphone next, and he strode onto the stage with the confidence of someone used to attention, raising his glass high while the crowd hushed in anticipation, and with a smirk, he declared to Mom and to real success the kind you can put your name on buildings with, pausing to let the audience react to his crafted punchline. A few people laughed and clapped, but others seemed less amused, though none of them said anything until a man near the back spoke loudly enough for half the room to hear. Hear that Hale not the kind of success that disappears overseas, and the sentence hit me like a slap, a public dismissal, wrapped in humor, the kind of casual cruelty that passed for conversation in this world. I felt my jaw tighten my fingernails, pressing crescents into my palms as I kept my gaze fixed on a spot on the carpet, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me react. And for a long moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse as heat rose through my body, burning hot enough to feel like anger, but grounded enough to feel like clarity, because I knew then that none of them had ever tried to understand me. Not truly, not beyond the neat little box they had placed me in since childhood. When the toast ended and people returned to chatting animatedly, I felt someone touch my elbow lightly. A middle-aged woman I vaguely recognized from church years ago, her expression polite and curious as she asked, "So what do you actually do over there?" And the question might have sounded harmless to anyone else, but to me, it felt like another small blade. Another reminder that in this town, my service translated to a vague abstraction rather than a tangible reality. I could have brushed it off, could have given another practiced answer that kept the peace, but something in me shifted the same quiet defiance that had carried me through nights overseas when fear pressed in from all sides, and I let a small, controlled smile lift the corner of my mouth as I answered softly, "I make sure certain people get to come home and brag at birthdays like this, my voice even, and calm the weight of the sentence landing with precision." For a second, she did not understand the meaning passing over her like a breeze, but a few nearby guests paused their expressions, shifting as the implication settled into place, and I saw their eyes flick toward Brandon on the other side of the room, their gazes assessing him in a way they had not before, as though for the first time recognizing that their golden boy's entire life had been built in the safety that people like me had fought to protect. The woman who asked me the question blinked, slowly murmured, "Oh, I see," and took a step back, clearly unsure how to respond. And though the moment was brief and subtle, it felt like the first stone placed in a foundation that would eventually crack open the false image they had always believed. I did not need to gloat or elaborate. I simply lifted my glass and took a drink, letting the room settle around me as the conversations resumed. And though the humiliation of the earlier speeches still hummed beneath my skin, something steadier began to take shape inside me, a quiet resolve that no longer shook in the presence of their judgment. For the first time that night, I felt a shift in the air, a small but certain tilt that suggested the narrative was beginning, however slightly, to turn, not outwardly, yet not in a way they would understand, but in a way that told me I was no longer the girl who shrank when mocked. I was the woman who had flown into fire and walked out carrying the lives of others, the woman they underestimated at their own risk. And as I set my glass down, I could feel the first sparks of a storm building quietly inside me, waiting for the right moment to break. Brandon was still holding the microphone when the room settled again, basking in the attention he believed was rightfully his. And as he smoothed a hand down the front of his suit, I could see the self-satisfied pride radiating off him, the same expression he had worn since childhood whenever he sensed an audience ready to adore him. Then, with a chuckle dripping in condescension, he lifted his glass and prepared to close his speech with the line I could see forming on his lips. "Some of us risk real money, not whatever she does in Boots," the words sharp enough to slice through whatever thread of restraint I had been holding onto, yet before he could release the full weight of his insult, the doors at the back of the banquet hall swung open with a suddenness that cut the room in half. Conversations halted mid-sentence forks, paused halfway to mouths, and even Brandon stopped speaking as every head turned toward the entryway, where a man in full dress uniform stood framed by the soft glow of the hallway lights, his presence commanding enough that people straightened instinctively, and he walked purposefully through the center aisle with a bearing that said he was not here for casual greetings or polite small talk. When he reached the middle of the room, he projected his voice across the hall with crisp authority. "I am looking for Major Hale Vaughn," and the words echoed through the ceiling, high space bouncing off polished wood and chandelier glass until the shock rippled outward in waves that nearly knocked the breath from me. A collective gasp rose from the audience, followed by murmurs that swelled into disbelief, and someone near the front whispered "Major," as if the word itself might crumble in their hands because none of them had ever used my rank. None had ever even asked. They had reduced everything I accomplished to vague overseas work or some hobby I had taken too seriously. And now the truth stood in the center of the room, wearing medals and certainty. Brandon still held the microphone, but his arm had lowered slowly, his face paling as though someone had pulled the ground out from beneath his feet, and my mother turned toward me with her mouth open. No words forming, only the dawning realization that something monumental had shifted. The officer, noticing the stunned silence, continued speaking with professional clarity, explaining that he had come from the Iowa Army National Guard headquarters on behalf of a joint ceremony planned for the following morning at Fort Riley, that the event would be live-streamed internally for command staff and would be of particular interest to Cedar Falls because the local Veterans Council intended to honor Major Vaughn in their Sunday service, and that he had been asked to deliver the formal invitation in person so that her family would be aware of the recognition. His tone remained neutral and official, giving just enough context without revealing anything classified, but every sentence he spoke dismantled a lifetime of dismissal, brick by brick until the structure of their narrative collapsed entirely. Then he delivered the line that froze the room completely. "They call you Ghost Angel, ma'am. It will be an honor to watch tomorrow." And even though he addressed me directly, his voice carried across every corner of the hall, reaching each person who had laughed, each person who had whispered, each person who had looked at me tonight as if I were less than worthy of space. The weight of the nickname settled onto the audience like a sudden winter, chilling the arrogance that had hung in the air moments earlier, and for a brief second the room was so silent that I could hear my own pulse, steady and calm, no longer racing with humiliation, but with the quiet, grounded certainty of someone finally seen. My mother blinked rapidly, her eyes darting between the officer and me, as if searching for an explanation that did not exist. Her practiced smile faltering until the corners of her mouth trembled with something between confusion and fear. While Brandon clenched the microphone with stiff fingers, his jaw tight and his expression darkening as he processed that the joke he had been about to make had been interrupted by a reality he could not compete with. The guests began to whisper among themselves in soft astonishment, some turning their bodies toward me, evaluating me again with new eyes, as though trying to reconcile the woman they had overlooked all evening with the person described by a uniformed officer who had just walked through the door. And then, from the far left of the room, a fragile, elderly voice broke the tension with a single breath of recognition. "Wait, you are the pilot who pulled our grandson out after that convoy attack." And an older couple rose slowly from their table, the man leaning heavily on a cane while the woman clutched his arm for balance, both of them staring at me with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude that cut deeper than any insult I had endured that night. They moved closer, weaving between tables with trembling urgency until they stood directly in front of me, the woman reaching out with a shaking hand to take mine, her eyes filling with tears as she whispered, "You saved him." We never thought we would get the chance to thank you, and the sincerity in her voice cracked something open inside me, something raw and unguarded. The room around us shifted again, not with hostility this time, but with a quiet ripple of awe as people finally understood the magnitude of the thing they had been mocking all evening. And for the first time in my life in Cedar Falls, recognition did not come in the form of shallow praise or conditional acceptance. It came from people whose lives I had touched without ever meeting them. People who saw my worth not through the lens of family expectations, but through the truth of what I had done. The older man squeezed my hand with surprising strength, nodding slowly and saying we prayed for the pilot who brought him home. We prayed every night, and I felt my throat tighten as the significance of the moment washed over me, a moment so starkly different from the decades of dismissal that had come before it. In that instant, the entire room seemed to pivot, the balance of power shifting with the quiet certainty of truth finally revealed. And as I stood there, surrounded by the stunned silence of a family that had spent a lifetime trying to make me small, I realized that this was the first real crack in their facade, the first time the world had forced them to see me for who I truly was. And it was only the beginning. The elderly couple's trembling gratitude lingered in my mind long after the banquet hall had fallen silent, and as the murmur of the stunned guests faded into a distant hum, I felt the past begin to rise inside me with the slow, cold certainty of a memory that never stays buried for long, one that lives in the bones rather than the mind. And before I even realized it, my thoughts drifted back to the night that had carved the name Ghost Angel into the lips of soldiers who had never seen my face in daylight. It had been late summer in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, a night so dark it seemed to swallow sound, and the only light came from the thin, jagged line of distant tracers and the scattered glow of burning debris left behind from the ambushed convoy. And I remember gripping the controls so tightly, my fingers ached beneath my gloves, breathing through the metallic taste of fear as the radio crackled with fragmented distress calls from the team that had gone down before us. The Black Hawk assigned to extract them had taken a round to its tail rotor and crash-landed a few clicks south, leaving my crew and me as the only available backup. And as we flew in low over the ridgeline, the gunner's voice cut through the headset confirming heavy fire from two directions, warning that the landing zone was barely holding. Yet even then, I felt a strange quiet settle in my chest, the kind that comes when the world narrows to the single task of getting people home alive. The terrain below was brutal, jagged rocks and narrow paths twisting along the mountainside, and the infrared feed showed flashes of movement around the convoy wreckage figures, crouched and firing into the darkness, while the wounded crawled behind what little cover they could find. And in the middle of that chaos was the young soldier, whose grandparents had just touched my hand in the banquet hall. Though I had not known his name that night, only his voice breaking through the static as he tried to report that they were pinned and running out of ammunition. As we descended, the first burst of fire hit so close to the fuselage that the vibration rattled my teeth, and my co-pilot shouted that we were being painted by something heavier than small arms. But there was no time to adjust, because the radio erupted with a panicked shout. "They are closing in. If we do not get pulled soon, we are done." And I felt myself slide into that intense, focused state I had only experienced a handful of times, a state where fear becomes a distant echo and instinct takes over. I dropped the bird lower, angling through a narrow pocket of terrain that offered partial cover, the blades cutting through dust, thick enough to blind us if we drifted even slightly. And when the ground crew flung open the doors, the heat of the firefight blasted into the cabin. Gunfire echoing off the mountains as medics leapt into the open, grabbing the wounded and pulling them toward the aircraft. I remember one soldier collapsing halfway across the landing zone, and two others dragging him forward. Bodies illuminated by the faint glow of muzzle flashes around us, and then a new wave of fire lit up the ridge, sending sparks skittering across the sand near my landing skids, and I felt the helicopter shudder under the stress of holding position. My crew chief yelled that we needed to lift now that we could not keep holding this spot without taking damage. But another voice cut across his younger one, raw with fear and determination. Someone shouting, "Wait, we still have one more, he is hit in the leg. We are not leaving him." And something inside me hardened because leaving someone behind was not an option. Not on my aircraft, not under my watch. I steadied the Black Hawk even as debris whipped across the cockpit, fighting the tremor in my hands and the roar of adrenaline pressing against my ribs, and I remember whispering, "Keep moving." "We are not done," into the mic, even though I knew my crew could not hear me over the gunfire. Then the last soldier appeared, stumbling between two teammates who braced his weight as they half-dragged him toward the ramp. And when they finally reached the cabin, the medic shouted clear as he slammed the door shut, and I pulled the aircraft up with a force that made the engines scream, banking sharply towards safer airspace, while rounds cracked through the night behind us. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The cabin filled instead with the labored breathing of the injured and the stunned quiet of those who had thought they would die on that mountain. And then a voice came through, soft and hoarse, the same young soldier who had whispered earlier, saying, "You came out of nowhere. You were like an angel out of the dark." And though I did not respond, the words settled into my headset and stayed there long after we delivered them to the field hospital. In the days that followed, the story spread the way stories do among soldiers passed between units during chow retold in fragments over radio chatter. And one afternoon, my commanding officer handed me a challenge coin from a general who had heard about the mission, telling me quietly that not many pilots would have held the line the way I did, that what I had done had saved more than lives. It had given people hope in the darkest moments. I thought that would be the end of it until months later, when a fellow pilot pulled me aside to show me a video captured from a helmet cam. During the extraction, a shaky recording of the firefight with the audio barely cutting through. But near the end, as the soldier with the leg wound tried to stay conscious, he whispered into the camera, "If that bird does not come, we are dead, Ghost Angel. If you hear this, thank you," and hearing that name spoken in fear and gratitude carved it permanently into the identity I carried from that day forward. Now standing in the bright polished hall of Cedar Falls, with that memory cutting through the noise of a lifetime spent being ignored, I felt something inside me shift, like a tide turning, because tomorrow at Fort Riley, that helmet cam clip would play before a room full of leaders, and nothing my family believed about me could survive the truth of that night. I barely made it to my truck before the night erupted again, not with gunfire this time, but with the shrill vibration of my phone, as message after message slammed into the family group chat, each one a fresh attempt to pull me back into the role they preferred, the role of someone small and guilty and apologetic. And when I finally glanced at the screen, I saw my mother's words blazing at the top. "You embarrassed me. People came to my birthday to celebrate me, and all they talked about was you." And even though the banquet hall still sat behind me, glowing with warm lights and expensive decorations, the bitterness in her voice cut through everything like a cold wind, sharp and familiar. Brandon chimed in, a moment later, adding his own brand of contempt. "Whatever that soldier worship is, do not bring it anywhere near my clients," as if my entire career was some messy inconvenience he had been forced to endure, and more messages followed from cousins and aunts. Passive-aggressive lines about stealing attention or making the night awkward, as if I had orchestrated the arrival of the officer, or the stunned silence that followed, as if I had asked the universe to finally let the truth bleed through the cracks. I closed the chat without responding because there was nothing to say not anymore, and I knew that if I stayed in that parking lot another minute, the weight of their entitlement would crush the calm I had been holding since the officer spoke my rank aloud. So I started the engine and drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, with the window cracked open, letting the crisp night air steady the racing of my thoughts. The headlights slid across empty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts until I turned down a side street near the edge of town, guided by a memory of a place that had once offered me a moment of peace during a difficult home visit years ago, and when I pulled into the small gravel lot, the sign above the door flickered softly. Veteran Grounds Coffee. The kind of place where the walls were lined with old unit patches and challenge coins, and where people understood silence better than small talk. Inside the warm glow of the cafe, the smell of roasted beans and aged wood wrapped around me, and behind the counter stood Tom Avery, a retired medic whose life I had once carried in the back of my aircraft after a mountain firefight had left him bleeding and barely conscious. He recognized me the moment I walked in and raised his eyebrows in that quiet, surprised way vets greet each other when words fall short. "Hale Vaughn," he said with a slow smile. "I heard there was something big happening for you tomorrow," and he motioned for me to come closer as he filled a mug with fresh coffee, sliding it across the counter, the way someone might offer shelter after a storm. I told him I had just come from my mother's birthday party, and he chuckled dryly before he even heard the details, muttering that family could bruise deeper than shrapnel sometimes, and that some wounds took longer to heal than the ones medics stitched shut in the field. And his words hit harder than he knew, because they were true in a way few civilians ever understood. I found myself telling him more than I expected, not the classified pieces or the things that would never belong in a public space, but just enough to let him understand the kind of night I had come, from the humiliation layered under polite laughter, the way the room shifted when the officer spoke my name, the way my mother refused to see me unless it was to strengthen her own image. And Tom listened without interruption, simply nodding along with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that some stories need room to breathe. When I finally ran out of words, he leaned against the counter and said, "Tomorrow, your ceremony will be streamed here on the big screen. You should stop by after it ends. A lot of locals like to watch those things, especially when it is someone from Cedar Falls. People will want to see you and say congratulations." And I felt something click inside me, not a plan fully formed, but the first quiet spark of one. Because if the town already respected what my family mocked, if they were willing to gather and watch a moment, my mother would have erased if she could. Then maybe there was a way to let the truth stand in the open without me ever having to raise my voice. I thanked Tom and sipped the coffee slowly, letting its warmth settle the lingering rawness in my chest. And while I stared at the military photos covering the walls, I saw what the next step needed to be. Not revenge in the loud theatrical way my family accused me of seeking, but something quieter, smarter, rooted in reality. The way real justice often is, the kind that reveals people to themselves without me uttering a single accusation. Tom clapped my shoulder as I headed for the door, telling me to rest because tomorrow would be big and people would want to see me shine. And as I stepped into the night again, I replayed my mother's angry message. Brandon's territorial warning, the years of dismissal, wrapped in polite cruelty, and the spark inside me sharpened into something like resolve. By the time I reached my truck, I knew exactly where I needed to go next and why. Because Carol had demanded a meeting before I returned to Kansas, a private conversation she claimed would clear the air, but which I knew would be another attempt to fold me back into the shape she preferred. Yet this time, I would not be walking in as the daughter who tolerated their contempt. I would be walking in as someone who understood that truth could be a trap as well as a weapon, and the first snare was already being laid. I drove to my mother's house with the cafe's warm lights fading behind me, the night settling heavier on my shoulders as I turned onto the familiar street, lined with trimmed hedges and porch lights, left on out of habit rather than welcome. And even before I stepped out of the truck, I could feel that particular suffocating tension that always lived inside those walls, a tension that had shaped most of my childhood and which now waited for me again, like an old enemy. When I opened the front door without knocking, the living room lights were blindingly bright, and the three of them were already seated, as if they had been rehearsing. This moment, my mother perched on the edge of the couch, with her hands folded tightly. Douglas leaning back with that detached disapproval he had perfected over the years, and Brandon sitting slightly forward with the smug posture of a man who believed himself in control of everything. And for a brief second, I felt like a teenager again being summoned into a tribunal I never asked to face. Carol spoke first, not with anger exactly, but with that cold, clipped disappointment she had always wielded like a weapon, saying, "I hope you understand the damage you caused tonight, Hale, because people left the party talking about you instead of my birthday, and that is not how family behaves." And she waited for me to shrink under her gaze the way I used to, but I stood still, calm, letting her words slide past without finding a place to anchor. She continued lecturing, insisting that I had made the evening about myself, insisting that I should apologize to the guests, insisting that I should promise not to bring military topics or uniforms into any future family events, because as she put it, not everyone wants to hear war stories or be reminded of the messy parts of life, and each sentence was sharp enough to cut, but delivered with the confidence of someone who believed her authority was unshakable. Douglas added that appearances matter in this town, and that I should recognize how my presence had unsettled the tone of the celebration. And Brandon chimed in with a smug grin saying, "Yeah, Hale, the night was supposed to be about Mom, and you turned it into something uncomfortable. Acting like a uniform gives you a free pass to steal attention, and the three of them waited for me to fold under the pressure the way I once did when I still wanted their approval. Instead, I breathed in slowly, steadying my voice, then said only, 'Do not worry after tomorrow. I will not be bringing my name into your parties at all.' And the room fell silent for a heartbeat before my mother exhaled with obvious relief, thinking I had submitted, and Brandon nodded approvingly as if he had successfully contained a problem. But none of them understood that my words carried a meaning entirely different from the one they assumed. They believed the conversation was over, believed I had accepted their version of reality. But Brandon, unable to leave triumph alone, shifted the topic as if he could pivot from disciplining me to using me, explaining with careless arrogance that he was on the verge of signing a lucrative partnership with a local veterans organization to build a retreat center, describing it as his next big deal, the kind that would elevate his reputation even further. And then he leaned back with a smirk and said he could really use a little help from me because a few photos in uniform would give the project credibility, saying people love that hero stuff. Hale, it would be good for the family. He said it like a compliment, like a favor. He was generously offering me. And when I did not respond, immediately he added, "Come on, you can help me look legitimate. These people love soldiers. Use that for something good." And his tone made it clear that in his mind my career was simply a convenient prop. I let a slow, thin smile appear, a smile he misunderstood and answered, "I will think about it. Let us see how you all talk about my so-called hero stuff tomorrow." And for once, Brandon did not know what to do with the shift in my voice, though he forced a laugh and assumed I was joking. Carol stood to end the conversation, clearly pleased that she believed she had regained control, telling me to behave better at future gatherings and to consider attending more church events to rebuild the family image. And Douglas murmured something vague about hoping I would not bring any more surprises to town, but I was already stepping away, already slipping my phone from my pocket with a slow, deliberate movement. They did not notice, and as I walked toward the door, I quietly tapped the screen to activate the voice recorder. The device captured the tail end of the conversation, their voices weaving together in tones laced with disdain as my mother muttered that I had embarrassed her in front of everyone, and Brandon scoffed that soldiers get glorified for nothing, and that my achievements were exaggerated, and that I played hero for attention. And none of them realized that the words they carelessly tossed around the living room would soon matter far more than they intended. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting my lungs, and I paused on the porch, letting the chill settle through me, grounding me, steadying the pulse in my throat as I replayed the last hour in my mind, recognizing for the first time that the power they once held over me no longer existed, and that the next 24 hours would reveal that truth in ways they were wholly unprepared for. I walked to my truck with the recorder still running, the voices fading behind me until the door shut and the sound cut off, and I sat for a moment gripping the wheel, thinking about the ceremony waiting at Fort Riley, about the cafe that would broadcast it to locals who had already begun to see me differently, and about how my family still believed they controlled the narrative, still believed they could shape who I was in this town. Then I exhaled quiet and steady and saved the recording under a name only I would understand, knowing its time would come soon enough, knowing that every cruel word they had spoken would be the first thread in the unraveling of the image they valued more than truth itself. Morning light broke over Fort Riley in a pale sweep of gold that glinted off the edges of the parade field and the polished windows of the headquarters building, and as I walked toward the entrance in my dress uniform, the weight of the fabric on my shoulders felt grounding rather than heavy, a reminder of every mile I had earned, rather than inherited, a reminder that today belonged to the version of myself my family had never cared to know. Inside the auditorium, soldiers filled the rows with quiet anticipation, their uniforms crisp, their boots aligned the air humming with the kind of solemn pride that settles in places where sacrifice is understood without explanation, and I took my seat near the front, the row reserved for those being recognized, feeling a strange blend of calm and intensity run through me as I smoothed the gloves in my lap. General Martin stepped up to the podium with the composed authority of someone who had spent decades leading through storms and victories alike. And when he began reading the citation, detailing the mission that had earned me this honor, I felt my heartbeat slow into a steady rhythm, not out of nerves, but out of the surreal distance that forms when you hear your own life described in the language of history, rather than survival. He spoke of the blackout, landing under fire, the successful extraction, the lives saved, and he paused only briefly before adding that this action had already been studied in multiple training units for its combination of precision and emotional resilience. And the auditorium remained so quiet I could hear the ventilation system whispering through the ceiling as he declared that what happened in those mountains represented the highest standard of Army aviation. I kept my breathing even while my mind drifted for a moment to the banquet hall the night before, where a room full of civilians had laughed when my mother diminished my career, and the contrast between those two worlds struck me with a sudden, sharp clarity, as if the distance between them were no longer measured in miles, but in values. When the general stepped aside, the lights dimmed, and the large screen behind him flickered to life, playing the helmet cam footage from that night, the edges grainy, and the audio crackling with the frantic breaths of the wounded. And then came the moment that had stayed with me for years. The young soldier whispering, "If that bird does not come, we are done, Ghost Angel. If you hear this, thank you." And even though I had braced myself for it, the sound still sent a cold shiver through my spine as the room absorbed the weight of the words. I felt eyes shift toward me, not in judgment or curiosity, but in something closer to reverence, something my family had never granted me. And somewhere in that same moment, far away in Cedar Falls, the television inside Veteran Grounds Coffee was showing the exact same footage to a growing crowd of locals who had come in for their morning drinks, only to find themselves caught in a swell of emotion they had not expected. Some of the guests from my mother's birthday party happened to be there drawn by weekend habit rather than intention, and I imagined the way their faces would change as they recognized the name from the officer's announcement the night before, the name they had mocked or ignored for most of their lives, and I could almost hear the whispering ripple through the cafe as people connected the dots and murmured, "That is her. That is the pilot they are talking about." Meanwhile, my mother, who had not been invited to the ceremony despite knowing it was happening, sat in her own living room with the morning broadcast playing because a neighbor had texted her asking if she was watching, and I pictured her stiffening in her chair as the anchor said the words, Major Hale Vaughn in Cedar Falls, in the same sentence her image of me cracking slightly as she listened to a decorated general praise the daughter she had dismissed as an embarrassment. I imagined the moment when someone from church or one of her closest friends turned to her and said, "Isn't that your daughter Carol?" My goodness, I had no idea. And the way she would swallow hard because she had built her social standing on the belief that Brandon was the only child worth mentioning. Back in the auditorium, the ceremony shifted to the final portion, and one of the leaders from the Regional Veterans Coalition stepped forward to address the crowd, a man I recognized instantly as one of the survivors from an earlier deployment, whose life I had once transported through the night after he had been hit by roadside shrapnel, and he spoke with the rough sincerity of someone who had lost too many friends to ever take survival for granted. He talked about community and service and the responsibility of honoring those who carried others home, and then he paused just long enough for the silence to sharpen before saying, "We have recently been approached by a real estate man named Brandon Vaughn, who pitched us a project he claimed would honor veterans, but something about it felt wrong, like it was built for profit, rather than people, and we are committed to working only with individuals who understand what service means." The air shifted because several officers had heard the name at the banquet hall, and a faint murmur swept the back rows as if the wind had passed through the room, but I kept my expression neutral, my posture steady, my breathing even letting the moment stand on its own, because this was not a revenge delivered in anger, but a truth revealed by the natural course of things, the kind that requires no embellishment. I saw the general glance toward me with a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging that he understood more than he said, and somewhere deep in my chest, a quiet satisfaction settled, not triumph exactly, but a sense that the scales were beginning to balance in ways my family would not easily escape. Outside the ceremony building, photographers waited to capture the honorees and reporters prepared brief statements for the local news, and as I stepped through the doors into the bright Kansas sunlight, I felt the weight of the moment settle onto my shoulders in a steadier, warmer way than any burden I had carried from my family, because the exposure had happened without anger, without shouting, without a single unkind word, and yet it carried a power sharp enough to fracture every lie my mother and brother had built about who I was. I walked across the courtyard toward the flagpole, hearing my boots echo against the pavement, and for the first time in a long time, I felt fully grounded in the truth of my own name, knowing the next steps would come naturally, and knowing that Cedar Falls was already beginning to see me in a way my family had refused to. The ceremony ended with sunlight pouring across the courtyard and a trail of congratulations echoing behind me. Yet the moment I slid into my truck and closed the door, the outside world softened into a hush that felt almost unreal, as if the chaos of the last day and the weight of my childhood were finally beginning to shift into something new, something steadier, something that belonged only to me. I had barely turned the key in the ignition when my phone vibrated with a new notification, and for a second I assumed it was another update from Fort Riley. But when I opened the screen, I froze because the sender was the Cedar Falls Veterans Association, the same group Brandon had bragged about approaching, and the email began with warm gratitude, addressing me as Major Vaughn, and inviting me to be the guest of honor at their upcoming Hero Night at Veteran Grounds Coffee, explaining that the town had taken pride in the ceremony, that people wanted to hear about leadership and resilience, and that they hoped I might share a few words if I felt comfortable. Reading their message stirred something unexpectedly tender inside me, something like validation but deeper, because it came not from rank or medals, but from a community that once saw only my brother, yet now wanted to honor the daughter they had overlooked for decades, and it took me a full minute before I could exhale and let the feeling settle. But the quiet appreciation barely had time to root itself before the next wave of the inevitable arrived, my phone buzzing again, and this time flashing Brandon's name on the screen, and I stared at it for a long moment, knowing exactly what kind of voice he would use, knowing the tone would shift the second he realized what the ceremony had done to the public narrative back home. When I finally answered, his voice came through with an exaggerated softness, too sweet to be genuine, saying, "Hey, sis, maybe we got off on the wrong foot last night. I have been thinking a lot about everything, and I just wanted to clear the air," and I leaned back in my seat, listening to the carefully rehearsed humility that coded every word. He went on to say that the video from the ceremony was blowing up, that people in Cedar Falls could not stop talking about Ghost Angel, that several of his clients had messaged him asking if that was really his sister. And then he pivoted with such predictable smoothness that I could almost recite his script, ahead of him saying, "We could partner up, put your face on my brochure, make the project more relatable and inspiring. People respond really well to heroic imagery, and it would be great for both of us." His voice was so cheerful, so falsely collaborative, that if I had not spent my whole life studying the subtle way he exploited other people's work, I might have believed he meant any of it. But I kept listening, letting him finish, letting him think the silence meant he was persuading me. When I finally spoke, my tone was soft enough to sound polite, yet cold enough to slice, telling him calmly, "You called my service fake last night, and I kept the recording, and I will not be your decoration." And the silence that followed was sharp and immediate, as if he had been slapped by a truth he had forgotten he exposed. He stammered something about misunderstandings or jokes taken out of context, but I ended the call without giving him room to redirect the conversation, because the real consequences were already forming in my mind, consequences that would not come from words, but from truth being placed in the right hands. An hour later, I arrived at a quiet rest stop on the way back to Cedar Falls and opened my laptop to respond to the Veterans Association's email, politely asking for clarification about the members involved in the retreat center project. And within minutes, the coordinator replied with gratitude and curiosity, explaining that their board had concerns about someone who had approached them earlier in the month, a man named Brandon Vaughn who seemed more focused on profit than purpose, and they wondered if I had any insight. My fingers hovered over the keys only briefly before I selected the audio file I had saved the night before the recording of Brandon mocking my service and saying, "Soldiers get glorified for nothing," and I attached it to the email with a short message explaining that I believed they deserved transparency before choosing any partnerships. I hesitated only long enough to make sure my intentions remained clean, not spiteful, before pressing send, and the moment the file left my inbox, I felt a serene certainty wash over me, a certainty that the truth would land exactly where it needed to. 3 hours later, the coordinator called me directly, his tone warm but firm, as he explained that after reviewing the recording, the board had unanimously voted to cut all ties with Brandon, and were instead moving forward with a different company whose values aligned with their mission. And he thanked me for my honesty and integrity in a way that reminded me why I had always respected the veteran community more than any image my mother tried to curate. By the time I reached the Cedar Falls town line, the news had clearly begun circulating because my phone lit up again with a call from my mother. And when I answered, her voice was trembling with a thin, shaky panic that carried none of the authority she wielded the night before, saying, "People at church are asking why your brother's project got dropped. This is destroying our reputation. Hale, you need to fix this." And her desperation came through in every wavering syllable. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her words press softly against the years of humiliation she had piled onto me, the way she dismissed my achievements, the way she mocked my service in front of a room full of people. And for the first time, I felt no guilt, no fear, no need to protect her image. I simply answered with a calm, steady voice, "Funny. That is exactly how it felt when you mocked me in front of the whole town last night." And before she could gasp or scramble for excuses, I ended the call, letting the silence seal the truth between us. Hero Night filled the small cafe with the warm amber glow of string lights draped along the walls, casting soft reflections over rows of mismatched tables that had been pushed aside to make room for folding chairs, And as I stepped inside in a simple sweater, jeans, and boots, rather than a uniform, the air shifted with the quiet curiosity of people who had gathered, not out of spectacle, but out of genuine respect, the kind that hums low and steady, rather than erupting loudly. I kept my head down long enough to let my eyes adjust and to steady the thrum inside my chest, because I had faced battlefield chaos with far more composure, yet something about being seen in my hometown in a way I never had been made. My heartbeat quickened as if my younger self were standing beside me, watching the moment unfold with wide, cautious eyes. Tom, the cafe owner, spotted me first and waved me toward the front with a grin that softened the tightness in my shoulders. And as I made my way through the crowd, I recognized several faces from the birthday party people who had once looked past me as though I were a shadow, and who now regarded me with tentative recognition, their expressions shifting slowly as the reality settled into place. When I reached the small stage area, Tom tapped the mic gently, calling the room to attention, introducing me with a fond pride that felt foreign yet soothing, saying many of you know her as Hale, the girl who grew up on Maple Drive and the daughter of Carol and Douglas, but in the Army they call her Ghost Angel. And a soft ripple moved through the crowd as the words spread from ear to ear, a mixture of surprise and dawning understanding, illuminating faces one by one. I stood still, absorbing the weight of that name spoken openly for the first time in my hometown, not by me, but by someone who had lived the consequences of my actions and survived because of them. And behind the front row, I saw two guests from the banquet whispering urgently to each other, no doubt replaying every insult, every laugh, every dismissive comment they had made, realizing now that those casual cruelties had been directed at someone who had carried lives through fire and darkness. The live stream camera set up near the counter captured the entire moment, broadcasting it into dozens of small living rooms across Cedar Falls, including my mother's, where she sat alone on her floral couch, watching the screen with tight lips and a trembling hand pressed to her chest, the weight of public perception finally shifting beneath her feet. The pastor who had toasted Brandon the night before sat in the second row, and when Tom finished speaking, the pastor stood slowly, as if compelled by something greater than himself, taking the mic with a thoughtful gravity before addressing the room in a voice that carried both conviction and regret, saying, "In this town we thought success was measured by buildings and business deals, but tonight we saw another kind of success, the kind that quietly saves lives and never asks for applause," and the crowd fell silent in a way that felt reverent as he nodded toward me, acknowledging truths the town had ignored for far too long. Across the cafe, one of the women who had mocked me near the buffet line covered her mouth with her hand as understanding dawned, and another guest from the birthday party lowered his eyes, unable to meet my gaze, their shame blooming in real time as the room embraced a new narrative that did not center my brother or my mother's curated image of the perfect son. Meanwhile, in my mother's living room, her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from church members and neighbors saying, "Hale is incredible. Why did you never talk about her accomplishments? How did we not know she was Ghost Angel?" And I could imagine Carol sitting frozen in the glow of the screen, struggling to stitch herself to a version of the truth she had spent years denying, only to watch the town rewrite itself around her without asking for her permission or approval. After the pastor stepped back, I was invited to say a few words, but I kept it brief, choosing gratitude over grandeur, because heroism was never the point. And when the room applauded, it felt like a gentle tide rising rather than a wave crashing, lifting me without demanding anything in return. Hours later, after the crowd had thinned and the chairs had been folded and stacked near the door, I stepped outside into the cold night air, letting the quiet settle around me like a second skin. And as I opened the truck door, my phone vibrated with a new message from my mother. A message, hesitant in tone, stripped of her usual authority, reading, "Hale, people are calling you our Ghost Angel. Now I do not know how to live with what we did to you." I stared at the words for a long moment, letting them exist without demanding anything from me. And when I finally replied, my answer came calm and simple and clean, saying that is not my burden to carry anymore. Closing the chapter with the same steady control I had learned in the cockpit and on the ground in places where clarity meant survival. I started the engine, and the radio clicked on mid-broadcast, playing a short segment from a regional news station, reporting on a decorated Army pilot known as Ghost Angel, who'd been honored earlier that day. And hearing the title spoken so casually in the middle of ordinary life made me smile a small, quiet expression, meant for no one but myself, as I pulled onto the highway heading back toward Kansas, where my duty and my peace waited. The white lines of the road stretched ahead into the calm night, and for the first time in years, the weight on my shoulders felt light and wholly mine. And as the lights of Cedar Falls faded behind me, I felt the story of my life settling into a new shape, one that no longer needed validation or apology. And if you have ever been dismissed by family only to rise beyond what they imagined, I would like to hear your story.